Hey guys, what's up? Today I'm going to show you how to turn your Fortnite hand cannon Nerf blaster from this into something a little more like this. In its stock form, this blaster fires the Nerf Mega Darts. The ones that it came with are the Fortnite themed colors. However, I'm going to be converting it to short the standard length darts, which it will fire way faster because of the large plunger tube. We're going to start with opening the blaster. I like to use one of these magnetic parts trays to hold all the screws so that I don't lose them as I'm disassembling the blaster. Okay, so here's what we got going on under the shell. We have the trigger and catch mechanism held back here. We have the plunger tube, the spring, the plunger rod, and then we have this return spring up at the top. So when you prime the blaster via the slide at the top, then it pulls this rod back. The spring catches against the back of the plastic here. The plunger rod will get stuck on the catch back here, and then you pull the trigger to lower that and then release the plunger rod, and then that fires the blaster. So it's pretty basic springer setup. One other bonus I think we have going on here is all the different colors on the shell are just different shell segments rather than being painted on the shell itself. So that should make a paint job pretty straightforward for this blaster via breaking it down and painting the different pieces their respective colors, so that'll be good. I usually take out all the little pieces so that I don't lose them, but you can pause the video now if you need a reference for how to put the blaster back together later. So here's where the majority of our modding is going to take place with the plunger tube. Now it does look like, fortunately, this one is really easy to disassemble, so we can just pop off the little tabs on both sides. Then we can lift it out, and it looks like this will just wiggle right off. We can remove the pieces to our air restrictor, and that'll give us a pretty good view right into the plunger tube. That was actually one of the easiest Nerf blasters to ever do that to. This orange piece also just pops right out. So the idea is we're going to rebarrel it. Instead of the Mega, I'm going to use a standard half-inch dart, and then we can go from there. That should give us a pretty good increase in velocity, especially if we put a longer barrel on this bad boy. So I'll get started with that in a second. Then the plunger rod, we can probably improve the seal by wrapping a little bit of Teflon tape underneath this O-ring and maybe even replacing the spray. I'm going to pop this guy off and see if I can find a suitable replacement. Okay, so after unwinding the original spring seen here, I took a K26 just to compare, and it looks like although it would fit over this rod, there's not really a way to wind it over because of how tight the coils are. So then I took a K25 spring, as you can see here, which is very comparable to the stock spring, both in diameter and in coil size. So this one's a little beefier though, so it looks like, because it's similar, you can wind it over in the same fashion that you would the stock spring, and we can replace it. So I'm going to cut down a section of this K25 spring stock, and then we can go from there, see how much it takes and if it improves the performance. Up next, for rebarreling the blaster, it looks like this little stock piece, which stopped the plunger in the plunger tube, is perfect for a half-inch PVC coupler. So I'm going to cut it in half because I only really need the half. Then I'm going to glue the two together, and then that will allow me to use any barrel I want with a half-inch PVC end. So like CPVC or PETG or even aluminum barrels will be easy to use with this blaster with a standard coupler system. Before I glue all those pieces together, I'm going to take anything that had grease on it, like the plunger, the pieces that went with that, the plunger head that had the O-ring, and anything else that had grease, and take it and wash it with soap and warm water to remove that, which would interfere with the glue. So once that grease is gone, we can get a better glue adhesion. So let's go do that now. Got to remove this piece in the middle, so I'm going to take some snips and clip off these corners. And then I'm going to just sand it down to make sure it's as smooth as possible. Also, you want a rough surface on the inside of this piece, as well as on the outside of your half coupler, so that way the glue adhesion will be better than if it was a smooth piece. So as you can see sort of on the inside, there's a little bit of a groove. I'm going to sand that down, so that way the coupler seats all the way in, instead of just down to that groove. So a little sanding with the Dremel will clean that up really easily. I've sanded the mating surfaces between these three parts, so now I'm going to take the coupler, use some 2-part epoxy, glue it into this ring, like that, with the coupler facing outward. And then I'm also going to glue it into the front of the plunger, just to ensure it's A, secure, because the little tab piece won't fit back on since I've removed the other barrel, and B, that'll ensure my air seal is pretty much 100%. So I'm going to glue those three pieces together in that orientation now, let it dry overnight, and then we will continue. Okay, so at this point we're going to get ready for paint. Luckily this blaster breaks down into all of the core components, with the different plastic colors actually being very easy to separate from each other, so that should make it really easy to get a multiple tone paint job. So I'm going to take all these pieces, wash them off with warm soap and water to get off any grease that might be remaining on the shell, and then we can go into prime and paint it. Normally I like to sand off all the warning text and fill in the logos with epoxy putty. Then I sand everything down from a 120 grit down to like a 400 grit, and then when I prime it should be nice and smooth, and that removes a lot of that from the blaster. But in the case of the Fortnite ones, I usually don't bother filling in as much stuff because the blaster is relatively distinctive, so usually I just sand off the warning text. So now that we got all the pieces spray painted respectively, we're going to do a little bit of weathering by dry brushing. Now how you achieve that is you need a little bit of acrylic paint. For this I'm going to be using black and silver for some of the black parts because the black obviously won't show up. And we're just going to take a little bit on a sort of wide-tipped brush with a lot of bristles, and then we're going to just take a little bit on our brush. We're going to wipe most of it off. You only really want a little bit of paint on the brush for this. And we're just going to take the piece, and we're just going to hit anywhere that might get a little bit more worn to give it a little bit of a sort of blackened edge or a little bit more of a worn look. It's a very slight example. This is the sort of technique where I feel that less is more. So if you overdo it, it's a little obvious, but if you do it subtly in a couple places, it might add some nice details to your blaster. So I'm going to go through, do the rest of the shell with this technique. I'm going to clear coat it with a matte clear coat just to make everything sort of look as if it's one layer of paint rather than a few piled up, and then we can go from there. So here we have the finished blaster with a bit of subtle dry brushing. So if you can hold it up a bit closer, you can see there's some very small touches, which I think gives it a little bit of a better look. And then the matte clear coat really helps it to finish out the look. I always think it's important to clear coat your blasters because A, it offers a little bit of extra protection on your paint job, and B, it sort of gives everything the same textured look. Before I had sort of a mix of matte and glossy, whereas this sort of flattens everything out and makes it look a bit more uniform. I'm also just going to lubricate the parts of the shell where the painted surfaces contact each other in the sliding motion, just to make the motion a bit smoother and reduce the friction, which could potentially chip the paint in the long run. I'm just going to use a little bit of this liquid Teflon silicone, but you could really use whatever. As far as our internals go, we have the plunger tube with the half coupler glued in, which we did earlier. Now I have the plunger rod, which I have put a couple wraps of Teflon tape under the O-ring to improve the seal. I'm going to re-lubricate everything and then put it all back together. And then I also cut a piece of this K25 spring stock to be a little bit shorter than the original spring, and I threaded it on. So hopefully this will work. If not, I can always trim down the spring to be a little bit shorter, but I think we should be roughly good to go with this configuration. One other thing too, for a lot of the sections of orange that I didn't paint, I'm just going to rough them up with a little bit of 400 grit sandpaper to remove some of the glossiness, and I might throw a little bit of black acrylic paint on here just to give it a bit more of a worn look. One other modification you have to do is Dremel out this front part where the new coupler sits. It's a little thinner. on the stock shell, so you got to Dremel out both sides to make it a little larger for this larger diameter circle. I did an internal shot before, but this is just to show what it looks like in the finished position. You don't actually have to modify the front to be able to slip in the 1/2 inch PVC to CPVC barrel that I'm going to be using, so that's a good sign. I'm going to put all the screws in and then we can do some test firing. I'm going to give this guy a shot with a 6-inch CPVC barrel and some Gen 3 worker darts. 145, 161, 144, 166. For our 5-shot test, we got a high of 166, a low of 144, and an average FPS of 154. I feel with some optimizing of the barrel, maybe it needs to be a little bit longer or shorter, and maybe a little bit more on the seal. We could probably get closer to that 200 range, but that's pretty decent for starting out with a Springer pistol, so with a little bit of tweaking, we could hopefully get it a little higher. While optimizing and tweaking the blaster too, it might be a good idea to go back in and reinforce some of the parts that hold on the plunger tube, like those little rings that go around and hold it in position, as that's really all that's holding in the plunger tube now. And with that heavier spring load, we might be damaging the blaster faster than if it was just a stock blaster, so we might have to reinforce some of those pieces just to improve the longevity of the blaster. Overall though, I'm pretty happy with how this mod turned out. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. And as always guys, thank you for watching and I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in another video.